Deliverance wasn't just a 1972 survival thriller about four suburban men paddling into the wild. It was a raw descent into primal fear, a film where fiction blurred dangerously with reality. Behind the camera, chaos erupted. Actors performed their own death-defying stunts, insurance companies pulled out, and small-town locals clashed with Hollywood outsiders. What audiences didn't see was a production teetering on the edge of disaster. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on 20 weird facts about Deliverance, from casting fights to broken bones, real-life tragedies, and the hidden legacy the film left on American cinema. And wait until you hear the bonus fact, a revelation so strange it reshaped how Hollywood insures its stars. Let's dive in. 1. Burt Reynolds nearly died in the rapids. Burt Reynolds wasn't about to let a stuntman steal his thunder. In one of the film's most infamous sequences, his character plunges down rapids in a canoe. Reynolds insisted on doing it himself. The result? A brutal wipeout that left him with a cracked tailbone and battered body. Later, when asked if it was worth it, Reynolds admitted, "Yeah, I looked better than the stuntman, but I also looked like I'd been hit by a truck." The wild part? Director Jon Borman told Reynolds the stunt was safe, only to watch him get nearly drowned by the current. It wasn't Hollywood magic. Those were real rocks, real water, and real pain. Reynolds later said it was the most dangerous thing he'd ever done, on or off screen. What audiences didn't realize, the star was just inches away from never finishing the movie. 2. No stunt doubles. Allowed in Deliverance, if you see an actor falling, swimming, or nearly drowning, it's not a stuntman. Jon Borman made a radical decision. No doubles. Insurance companies balked, eventually refusing to cover the production. That left Burt Reynolds, Jon Voight, Ned Beatty, and Ronnie Cox on their own. They paddled their own canoes, scaled their own cliffs, and risked their own necks. The canoe flips? Real? The bruises and cuts on their bodies? Authentic. One scene shows Voight hanging from a cliff by his hands. No trick rigging, no safety harness. He climbed it himself, terrified, with the cameras rolling. Borman believed authenticity would elevate the story. And he was right. The film's danger feels visceral because it was. But the decision set a new precedent in Hollywood. Realism at all costs, even when it meant risking lives. 3. Ned Beatty's traumatic first role. Ned Beatty made his film debut in Deliverance, and it was brutal. Cast as Bobby, Beatty endured one of cinema's most infamous sequences, the shocking assault in the woods. For a first-time actor, it was baptism by fire. Locals in the rural Georgia town where the movie was filmed harassed him, calling him "squeal like a pig" for years afterward. The experience haunted him. Beatty once said, "That scene followed me my whole life. People thought it was funny. It wasn't funny to me." He battled typecasting, with casting agents forever associating him with the role. What audiences didn't know, Beatty almost quit acting altogether after the humiliation he endured both on set and off. Yet his performance became unforgettable, anchoring the movie's darkest truth, that survival wasn't just about nature, but human cruelty. 4. Jon Voight's cliffside nightmare. Jon Voight faced his own trial by terror. For one critical scene, he had to scale a 125-foot cliff without ropes. Borman told him it had to look real. So Voight climbed, hand over hand, inch by inch, knowing a single slip could kill him. He admitted later that he was shaking with fear the entire time. What the audience didn't see was the panic off camera. Crew members begged Borman to use a stuntman or safety rigging. He refused. Voight, pressured by pride and professionalism, pushed forward. At the top, exhausted and trembling, he delivered a performance so convincing because it wasn't acting. It was survival. The fear in his eyes wasn't scripted. It was primal, raw, and very real. That moment turned Voight from just another actor into a leading man with grit carved into his reputation. Fifth, locals turned against the production. Filming in rural Georgia wasn't easy. The crew had to negotiate with small-town residents who weren't thrilled about outsiders portraying their community as violent, lawless, and backwoods. Many locals felt insulted, believing the film painted them as degenerates. Some even threatened the cast. Burt Reynolds later joked, "We weren't acting scared of those hillbillies. We were scared of the real ones off camera." The tension was constant. Locals sabotaged equipment, disrupted filming, and harassed the actors in bars. Borman leaned into the hostility, using it to heighten the film's atmosphere of dread. Ironically, once the movie was released, tourism boomed. The same communities that had cursed the film now profited from visitors who wanted to see the infamous river for themselves. But during production, it was open hostility, turning each day of shooting into a battle on two fronts. 6. The Banjo Boy wasn't really playing. One of the most iconic scenes in Deliverance is the Dueling Banjos showdown between Drew on guitar and a young backwoods boy plucking his banjo. The sequence feels authentic, almost documentary-like, but here's the twist. The boy wasn't actually playing. Billy Redden, the 16-year-old cast for his unusual look, couldn't play a note. The banjo sound came from another musician hidden off camera. To sell the illusion, the crew devised a clever trick. They had Redden fake the finger movements while someone else reached around from behind to strum the strings. The result was eerie, almost uncanny. Audiences believed they were witnessing raw, native talent. Redden later admitted he felt exploited, paid little, treated as a curiosity, then left behind when the film became legendary. The boy on screen became iconic, but his real story was far less harmonious. 7. Dueling Banjos sparked a legal war. The haunting tune from Deliverance wasn't written for the movie. Dueling Banjos existed long before 1972. Originally called Feudin' Banjos, it was composed by Arthur Guitar Boogie Smith in 1955. The filmmakers used it without credit, assuming no one would notice. Smith noticed. Furious, he sued Warner Brothers for copyright infringement. The case dragged on for years, eventually ruling in Smith's favor. He received not only financial compensation, but also full credit for the song, which went on to become a radio hit. The irony? The lawsuit made Dueling Banjos even more famous, embedding it into pop culture forever. What audiences didn't know as they hummed along to the banjo duel was that it was born in controversy, a battle not between instruments but lawyers. It became one of the most notorious music lawsuits in film history. 8. The river nearly killed the crew. The Cahulawassee River may look cinematic on screen, but for the cast and crew, it was a nightmare. The water levels fluctuated wildly, and sudden rainstorms turned calm stretches into deadly torrents. Boats capsized, equipment was lost, and actors were battered against rocks. Burt Reynolds called it a death trap. One night, a flash flood swept through the camp, destroying tents and nearly drowning crew members in their sleep. Jon Borman later admitted he underestimated the river's danger, but he refused to fake it with studio tanks. He wanted the real wilderness, no matter the cost. The gamble paid off artistically, but behind the scenes, people were injured, sleep-deprived, and constantly on edge. When you watch those canoes fight the current, remember, it wasn't just performance. It was survival against a river that wanted them gone. 9. Ronnie Cox's harrowing first role. Like Ned Beatty, Ronnie Cox was a newcomer when he joined Deliverance. His first major role was Drew, the idealistic guitarist. Cox was thrown into danger from day one. In the chilling scene where his canoe tips and he drowns, there was no stunt double. He had to float lifelessly in raging water while the crew filmed. Cox later confessed it was terrifying. He was genuinely unsure if he'd survive. At one point, he inhaled water and nearly blacked out. Borman pushed him to continue, saying the realism mattered more than his fear. For a rookie actor, it was brutal initiation. What audiences didn't know was that Cox left the set shaken, but with a reputation for commitment. That single film launched a career that would later see him in RoboCop and Total Recall. But his start came in the cold, merciless waters of Georgia. 10. The Studio Wanted. Major stars. Before Burt Reynolds and Jon Voight signed on, the studio had bigger names in mind. Warner Brothers pushed for Marlon, Brando, Charlton Heston, or even Jack Nicholson. But director John Borman resisted. He wanted relatively unknowns, men who felt real, suburban professionals, not Hollywood legends. Heston reportedly turned it down, saying the script was too grim. Brando wasn't interested in the physical demands. Nicholson, at the time, was busy pursuing other projects. So Borman gambled on Reynolds, a TV actor struggling to break into film, and Voight, who was respected but not yet a household name. The decision paid off. The lack of star power made the story more believable, immersing audiences in the nightmare. Ironically, Deliverance made Reynolds a superstar and transformed Voight into a serious leading man. The studio's doubts turned into one of the film's greatest strengths. 11. The infamous squeal line was improvised. Few lines in cinema history haunt audiences like "squeal like a pig." But here's the shocking truth. That line wasn't in the script. The original plan called for an even more graphic sequence, but the actors and director knew it would never pass censors. So during filming, the line was improvised on the spot. The result was chilling. The absurdity of the command mixed with the violence made it unforgettable. Ned Beatty later said he hated that it followed him for decades, but he admitted the improvised line worked, so much so that it overshadowed the rest of his performance. What audiences didn't realize, censorship accidentally created one of the most terrifying and quotable moments in film history. And before we move on to the next fact, go ahead and like and subscribe, because just like Deliverance, the deeper we go, the darker and stranger it gets. 12. Burt Reynolds and Jon Voight fought constantly. On screen, their characters clash with tension. Off-screen, the rivalry was real. Burt Reynolds, brash and competitive, constantly butted heads with Jon Voight, who was more methodical and serious. Crew members said the two barely spoke between takes. Reynolds mocked Voight for being too careful, while Voight accused Reynolds of reckless showboating. The cliff-scaling scene was particularly tense, with Reynolds mocking Voight's fear. But Borman secretly loved the friction. It mirrored the character's dynamic, adding authenticity. What audiences didn't know? The icy stares and biting words weren't always acting. They were men who genuinely didn't like each other, channeling that hostility straight into their performances. Ironically, the animosity may be what gave the movie its raw, jagged edge. 13. Insurance companies. Abandoned the film early in production, insurance brokers took one look at the call sheets, actors doing their own stunts, whitewater rapids, no safety rigs, and walked away. They refused coverage. That meant if anyone died, the liability would fall on Warner Brothers and Borman himself. The studio panicked, begging Borman to scale back the risks. He refused. To him, Deliverance had to feel real, not like a Hollywood set piece. So the movie pressed forward uninsured. That decision haunted the production. Every accident could have bankrupted the studio. Reynolds' cracked tailbone, Voight's near-death cliff climb, Cox's drowning scare. Each could have shut the movie down forever. What audiences didn't realize was that Deliverance was one misstep away from financial ruin. It wasn't just a movie about survival. It was made under survival conditions. 14. John Borman's obsession. Nearly broke the cast director. John Borman wasn't content with good enough. He demanded absolute realism, pushing his cast to the brink. He refused to use stunt doubles, dragged them through freezing rivers, and insisted they shoot in remote locations far from comfort. Reynolds later said, "Borman wanted blood." And he got it. Ours. The intensity fractured the cast. Ned Beatty resented the humiliation of his role. Ronnie Cox nearly drowned. Reynolds suffered broken bones. Voight battled paralyzing fear. Yet Borman refused to let up. He argued that pain and exhaustion made the performances authentic. Looking back, actors admitted he was right. The rawness on screen came directly from their suffering. But they also swore they'd never endure something like it again. The obsession with realism gave the film its edge, but left scars, emotional and physical, that lasted decades. 15. The film boosted whitewater tourism and deaths. When Deliverance hit theaters, audiences were captivated by the wild rapids and unforgiving river. What they didn't realize was that Hollywood's depiction would spark a real-world craze. Suddenly, whitewater rafting exploded in popularity. Tourists flooded into northern Georgia, eager to relive the adventure. But the river was just as deadly off-screen as it was on it. Untrained rafters capsized, broke bones, and in some cases, drowned. Local rescue teams reported a surge in accidents after the film's release. Burt Reynolds later said he regretted the unintended consequences. "We made it look like fun. It wasn't fun. It was dangerous as hell." What audiences didn't know was that Deliverance created a boom-and-bust industry, thrilling some, killing others, and forever changing the landscape of rural Georgia. The movie blurred the line between spectacle and real-world tragedy. 16. Jon Voight slept in the woods to feel the fear. Jon Voight wasn't a method actor by reputation, but during Deliverance, he pushed himself into extremes. To prepare for the harrowing cliffside climb and scenes of isolation, Voight camped alone in the Georgia wilderness. No tent, no crew, just him, the bugs, and the oppressive dark. He later admitted he was terrified. Every crack of a branch or howl in the night made his imagination race. But he insisted it gave him the edge he needed. When you see the fear in his eyes as he dangles from a cliff or sneaks through the woods, it's not just acting. It's a man remembering what it felt like to be truly alone, prey in an unfamiliar world. What audiences didn't know: Voight's performance wasn't rehearsed panic. It was lived fear, brought back from a night in the unforgiving wild. 17. The shoot was brutally low budget. Despite its impact, Deliverance wasn't a blockbuster production. The entire budget was only about $2 million. By Hollywood standards, even in 1972, that was threadbare. To save money, Borman cut corners. No stunt doubles, no insurance, no big-name stars. The crew reused costumes, and the cast endured punishing conditions without proper safety equipment. But the lack of money added grit. The rough, unpolished edges made the story more believable. The canoes were old and beat up. The actors' clothes were torn for real. The sweat and grime weren't makeup. They were consequences of working long hours under the Georgia sun. What audiences didn't know, the movie's realism wasn't just a choice. It was necessity born of poverty. Out of financial constraint came one of the most authentic survival stories ever filmed. 18. The corpses were crew members in disguise. Toward the end of the movie, when the men bury their attackers in the woods, audiences see haunting images of corpses covered in dirt and leaves. But those weren't dummies. With no budget for realistic props, Borman improvised. Crew members volunteered to lie still in the ground, covered in makeup and mud, for hours at a time. The effect was eerie. The camera lingers on lifeless faces that are disturbingly human, because they were. One crew member later joked that he nearly suffocated under the soil when Borman demanded a retake. What audiences didn't realize was that the horror of those scenes came not from Hollywood special effects, but from real people pretending to be dead in the cold, wet earth. The realism was haunting because it was exactly that, real. 19th, Burt Reynolds called it his best film and his worst experience. For Burt Reynolds, Deliverance was a turning point. The film made him a superstar, elevating him from television actor to Hollywood icon. He often said it was the best film he ever made, but he also admitted it was the most miserable experience of his career. The injuries, the cold, the constant danger. It wore him down. Reynolds claimed he lost respect for Hollywood comforts after Deliverance. He realized acting could be brutal, physically punishing work. And while the movie opened doors to decades of fame, he was also forever tied to the hardships he endured on that river. What audiences didn't know, Reynolds carried scars from the shoot for the rest of his life. The pain was permanent, a reminder that great art often comes at devastating cost. 20th. Locals tried to sabotage the premiere. When Deliverance was released, it wasn't embraced by everyone. In the small Georgia towns where it was filmed, many locals were furious at how they were portrayed. Primitive, violent, and cruel. Rumors spread that some even considered sabotaging screenings to stop the film from spreading. The tension reached such a point that Warner Brothers hired extra security at some premieres. Yet, despite the anger, the movie's reputation grew, attracting critical acclaim and audience fascination. In time, the very communities that despised it began profiting from tourism. What audiences didn't realize was that at the moment of release, the movie teetered on controversy, beloved by critics, hated by locals, and destined for infamy. The line between art and insult had never been thinner. Bonus fact, Warner Brothers tried to bury the film, literally. Here's the twist almost no one knows. Warner Brothers executives initially hated Deliverance. They thought it was too grim, too raw, too disturbing. After early test screenings left audiences shocked and unsettled, the studio considered shelving it altogether. At one point, executives floated the idea of a limited release just to recoup costs, then quietly burying it. But when critics raved, calling it daring and unforgettable, Warner Brothers changed course. The movie went wide, became a box office smash, and earned Oscar nominations. Ironically, the same film executives once tried to suppress ended up defining 1970s cinema. Deliverance wasn't just a survival thriller, it was a dangerous experiment in realism, where actors risked their lives, locals rebelled, and chaos brewed behind every camera setup. What emerged was a film that scarred its cast, enraged communities, and reshaped Hollywood. Its legacy isn't just about men lost in the wilderness, it's about a production that nearly collapsed, but delivered one of the most unforgettable American films ever made. So what do you think? Was Deliverance worth the risk? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe for more behind-the-scenes stories. And remember, sometimes the scariest part of a movie is what happens when the cameras aren't rolling.